As part of their enduring commitment to justice, equity, and expression, the Open Society Foundations are proud to sponsor Many Lumens. You're listening to Many Lumens, where we talk about and find meaning in the intersections of art, social change, and popular culture. I'm your host, Maori Karmael Holmes. For this episode, I'm joined by filmmaker, writer, curator, and photographer Sky Hopinka. Sky's work explores language, geography, and the relevance of the mundane. He is the producer of 13 short films, including Jaji Aprox and Dislocation Blues, the feature-length film maڵni, and is the author of the books Around the Edge of the Encircling Lake, Perfidia, and The Poor Farm. Producing films for just 10 years, Sky has quickly gained notoriety. In my conversation with Sky, we discuss what it means to create work that isn't centered around whiteness and work that is intuitive and familial. We hear about how Sky locates himself within his projects, the way he comes to understand them, and how at times it leaves him with more questions than answers. I also ask Sky about the impact his family has had on his artistic practice and what it means to protect and nurture the space for those you hold closely. I read about you being born in Northern Washington and spending time in Southern California and then ultimately going to Portland and living all over much of the Pacific coast and the Northwest. And there's a quote that I wanted to share and ask you about. You say that the Pacific Northwest landscape is familiar to me. It's my home, but not my homeland, as my tribes are from Wisconsin and Southern California. Thinking about this idea of home and belonging for, Black and Indigenous folks in particular is marked by unmeasurable violence. Yet we still make lives and worlds in the face of that. And I was curious for you, where and with whom do you feel most at home?
I think about that question a lot. I've moved around so much throughout my life that wherever I can find home in these different places, it feels comfortable, or just like, here I am and with my friends in this space. Or I'm going back to Washington to visit my mom and this feels like home. Going to grad school in Milwaukee, that was great and all, but I was, the only native in my cohort, and it's predominantly white program. And there's some really amazing people there. They're part of that and friends, but it's just whenever I'd go to spaces with Native people, that would feel like home in a different way. Mm-hmm. A certain sort of easing of these tensions that I didn't realize I was carrying in these white spaces. And I always try to take note of that tightness you're carrying with you as you navigate spaces that aren't your own. Actually, the places I was thinking about specifically are powwows. I feel like me in some ways, or the me that I don't realize, isn't visible. I grew up dancing since I was 4 years old, powwow dancing. And it's a big part of my life. I always think about that when I get on the dance floor. Just also how I'm a really shy and anxious person who doesn't like being in front of people or speaking in front of people, but always getting my outfit on and dancing always felt really special.
There's a moment in your film maڵni where you ask Sweetwater Same what she was like as a kid, and she laughs and responds and says, "I'm a Taurus." And so I'm a Taurus. So I really appreciate that. And I wanted to ask you, what were you like as a kid, and what is your sign?
I'm an Aries, but I was born on March 20th, so I think I grew up thinking I was a Pisces. And it wasn't until I got one of those phone apps where you can put in your birth time and location, and it said I was an Aries. So I guess that made a lot of sense. I feel like I can be a bit stubborn, and especially as a kid, I was pretty stubborn. Whether that was playing with Legos or getting annoyed at my sister for tearing down said Legos, or just really being focused on reading and on making stories and spending time with my friends and playing outside. Yeah, I feel like I was pretty thoughtful and introverted, but at the same time, somewhat determined, I think.
Yeah, I can feel Aries energy from that. Well, happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your parents? I've read different things about them participating in cultural traditions like powwow, and I was wondering, are they artists? What were they sort of doing, and how did they influence you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess even like later in life too, I've started to think more about like, them as artists or just being artists in a different form outside of the academic kind of Western understanding of that term. Yeah, my dad, I wasn't too close to him growing up. He was like, in a nearby town, but I'd see him every now and then. My dad, I think that he got a high school diploma. My mom, she got her GED when she was 15, 16. High school wasn't it for her, but they were never really involved in higher education. And I must have been around 6 or 7. And my mom must have been like 26, 27 when she started working at the Lumens casino as a blackjack dealer and working graveyard. Mm-hmm. That really became like, her career, where she just worked in the casino industry and worked her way up to being a table games director. My dad, I think that he got a high school diploma, but they met on the powwow trail. My dad was a drummer. He and his grandfather, who I'm named after, Blue Sky, they would travel around to powwow, and that's where he would learn how to drum and how to sing. And same thing with my mom too. Like, she got her GED so she could like focus on dancing. And so her and my grandma would travel around and go to powwows, and she'd compete and she'd dance. And that's how they met.
Oh, wow. That's really beautiful. Do you know what your parents assumed you would be when you grew up?
No, I have no idea. Yeah, my mom's always been really like, and my grandma, my maternal grandmother, was always like really encouraging me to just find what I want. I feel really grateful for that. I think they wanted me to go to college and they wanted me to pursue these passions. Like my grandma was always, she taught me how to play piano and was really encouraging me to play music. When I had a band in high school and early years of college, she was really supportive of that. She always liked to hear us practice in the garage when I was a teenager. And my mom was just, is like this, the things that she went through, the things that the family went through in life, that really made her want me to like see what was beyond that. Whatever I wanted to do, she said, you want to come work at the casino, work at the casino. You want to like go to college, go to college. You want to play music, but just make sure you do it.
Mm-hmm. I also had a lot of freedom as a child. Sometimes I feel like that freedom was too much.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I wish I had a little hand, but we always want what we didn't have, right? I read a bit that you have been always attracted to storytelling, and that you thought you might be a writer when you were growing up. Also that you played music, and that's been a part of your world. And filmmaking uses both writing and music in very big ways to present the final form. And I'm curious for you, what attracted you to filmmaking and how have you come to be known for that?
Yeah, I mean, I've really been interested in trying to write probably since I was a kid. I remember, being like 8 or 9 and trying to like make my own comic book. That didn't turn out so well. I gave up after 1 or 2 pages, but still there was that desire there. And same thing with music too. I remember around 8 or 9, my grandma started teaching me how to play the piano. But again, I didn't really have that sort of discipline to dedicate to the craft. It was something that I liked to do on my own terms when I wanted. So that kind of like followed me throughout my life. When I started like, playing guitar, I was a teenager, and when I started writing more and just never really feeling that good at it. And so, in college, in my many, many years of college, I studied English literature and also got into films. Like Belatar's Werkmeister Harmonies was one of the first films that I saw that really showed me what the potentials of film were or are. And I don't know, a few years after that down the line where I also had a fleeting passing interest in photography. I guess all of those different interests seem to combine in a way where you have storytelling, you have music and editing, and then you have film and photography and composition, this visual language that all really seem to combine these interests or these things that I've been pursuing throughout my life in a haphazard sort of fashion.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. Filmmaking for me has felt like a kind of total form that incorporates the 100 different things that I'm interested in. When you said many, many years of college, I felt like there was something there. Were you in school longer than 4 years?
Oh, way longer. I mean, like, high school was kind of one of those things too, like where I feel like I was a student that would fall through the cracks. Especially being native, like going to high school and going to middle school, it's just like, I had no idea, like, what AP classes were or just like what those tracks were or to think about colleges or like how to prepare for the SATs. Those are things that like no one ever talked to me about. And my senior year of high school, and I had to teach my English teacher, Miss Hardy. She was really important in preparing me for what college would be. I went to 4 community colleges. College of the Deserts, Riverside Community College, the Northwest Indian College, and Whatcom Community College before I ended up at Portland State University. And I graduated when I was 28, I think, 28, 29. After years of dropping out of college, working a bit, and then coming back to college.
Well, and what were you studying? Were you kind of all over the place with majors that whole time, or were you always pursuing English?
English and language. I took a black and white photography class when I was 18, but I dropped out halfway through, so I never got to the developing stage. So I knew how to use a camera, but I didn't know how to develop photos. And yeah, it's kind of like the story of my academic struggles, I guess, is just like taking classes here and there that kind of piqued my interest, but not really feeling drawn to anything. But for the most part, it was English. English literature was this thing that I figured I don't know what else I want to do, but I know I love reading and I love writing and I love thinking about books and talking about them. But I ended up not getting an English degree. I just wanted to graduate at that point, and I was working with a lot of Indigenous language revitalization, and I needed to take like one more semester for a general education requirement, and I was just over it. So I got a degree in liberal arts, and it was the easiest one to get. So I just said, I'm done. Give me that paper.
Yeah, that's that Aries efficiency. So I'm gonna settle on you being an Aries. So you were learning film, and I think you're principally self-taught, and then you studied formally afterward. But you were studying film the same time you were learning. And please forgive me if I'm saying this incorrectly. Chinukwawa.
Yeah.
Which is one of your mother tongues, and I was just curious about what was happening for you politically and artistically as a young adult to be training both in language and in this artistic practice at the same time?
I guess I was just talking a lot of shit. I feel like at that time, it was like, very much near the end of like, I want to graduate. I mean, I told my grandma I'd graduate, and she passed away at that point. And it was the last 2 years of, that was in college, that one, I wanted to get my foreign language requirement met in an Indigenous language. And you could do that at Portland State. And so Chinook made sense for me for a lot of reasons, where it's not one of my Indigenous languages, but it's the language from the region that I was living in. And I wanted to learn Ho-Chunk, but the nearest speaker is like 2,000 miles away. And it was hard. I met my Chinook teacher, Evan Gardner, and he said that I'd be doing a few things if I learned Chinook. I'd be supporting the language of the land that I live on, and I'd also be learning some pedagogical techniques that I could then apply to Ho-Chunk and to share with others. And that really made a lot of sense to me. And so I started learning Chinook to get that foreign language requirement met and to be part of this language community and to engage in language revitalization, which is something that I've been wanting to do since I was a kid. And around that time too, it was like, I guess just like the friends I had, like we were just talking and really dissatisfied with Native cinema, or just felt like it didn't speak to us. Just acknowledging yes, it's important to acknowledge historical trauma and the tragedies and the different parts of what it means to be Native in this country and how complicated it is. But what are the things that are not being shown on film? What are the things that, we want to see that represent us? If I want to make films about the things I want to see, then why not make them? And so, I remember just talking to a friend of mine one day and saying, God, this film sucks. He was like, yeah, it's better than your film. And so I was like, you're right. So I just decided to I had a little point and shoot camera. And so I was just taking photos, and I started to record video. And we went and built a fishing scaffold on the Columbia River. And I brought my camera with me, and I just started to document and just record video, and learned how to use iMovie, and just kind of went from there.
Yeah. Toni Morrison said she started writing because she hadn't picked up a book that she wanted to read, or it was something, I'm bungling the quote, but yeah. I'm really curious, so much of your work has existed in sort of a white cube space, is in galleries and museums, and isn't necessarily in cinemas outside of festivals. So the filmmaker Arthur Jafa, who talks about how he didn't choose the art world, it kind of chose him after decades of trying to make films. And it just sort of wasn't quite working for him. But I'm curious for you, because, it feels to me, for someone who's only been making films for 10 years, you're very successful. The films are being received well, and, you're continuing to find more opportunities to make the work. And so I'm wondering how you came into the sort of art world. Did you know that was going to happen? Was that something you wanted? Or did you think you were going to make films that would be sort of in the bigger cinema space?
I feel resonant with that Arthur Jafa quote. Not quite sure how it happened, but I think it's part of like not really understanding how these things work. Just like, I think this is how things go. This is like where you should cut things together. And like, I guess I should submit to film festivals. It's what it seems like you're supposed to do. And so that's kind of how I approach the art world as well, where after a few years of getting into Indigenous film festivals as well as experimental film festivals, I felt like, okay, this is like where experimental film lives. And it was actually the Wisconsin Triennial in 2016, I believe, where they asked to program some of the films in like a gallery space. But I was really unhappy with how it was installed. They put like computer speakers on top of a projector and it was really bright. But I was really like, okay, this could work, like I can see why the curator explained that they felt like there was a sort of looping quality to the films where you don't need to see them from beginning to end, but you can encounter them whenever. And I like to think about my films as circular in a sort of way, or non-linear, or like leading into like the editing approach like non-linearly, in a non sort of like, Western idea of having a 3-act structure or 5-act structure or whatever. I think it was like the Whitney Biennial as well, where they installed one of my videos in the gallery space. And that, I think, really opened up a lot of doors for me. Because like, one, it showed other curators what these films look like installed. And that in some ways, sometimes others are just looking for permission or just like looking for someone to make that first leap. And I feel like that's what happened with my video work, where then after that, other curators would write me and ask if I could install the work. And I was like, sure. I love cinema spaces, but I also feel like having an experimental film play one weekend on like a Friday afternoon in whatever city, there isn't a lot of access or accessibility for this work. And I mean, I like the idea of like a film being up for a month or 2 months and people can walk in, people can encounter it, people can see it as many times as they want or walk out after 5 seconds. And then that further informed me wanting to make multi-channel work or work specifically for the gallery space where it is a bit more free from the constraints of a cinema.
Bringing up the biennial, were you in the 2017 biennial?
Yes.
Okay, because I know we both were curators of the film program in 2019.
Yes, yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, taking on that role as a curator, you've had, of course, your long-going film series that you've done. And with that program in particular, what is it that you're aiming to do when you program work together?
Like with that series, the title is What Was Always Yours and Never Lost. I think the idea was for it to be like an ongoing program where some work would be the same, like some work would come in from different makers, but just to be part of the series that could change different iterations or be iterative. That really was, I think, the beginning of just like trying to find other Indigenous filmmakers who are making experimental work or work that doesn't fit into the narrative or documentary camps, and to really find that community, because it really didn't feel like there was that many other Indigenous experimental filmmakers out there or support for them either.
So the Yellowknives Dean Scholar Glenn Sean Coulthard, in his book Red Skin, White Mask, extends the work of Frantz Fanon to talk about recognition and inclusion, how recognition and inclusion from the settler state will always be a trap. He writes that we need to center our own politics of revaluing, rebuilding, and deploying Indigenous cultural practices based on self and community recognition. And I see that happening deeply in your work, and that's what you've been talking about. And I just wanted to ask, how do you navigate an industry, that's bent on representation and tokenistic inclusion while foregrounding the relational politics of your work as you continue to get recognition from the art world and from independent film spaces? How do you continue to come back to your original intent?
I think it has a lot to do with how I got started in experimental film. There's quite a few labs, native spaces, native organizations that I applied to in 2012, 13, when I was just starting out and got rejected from. And maybe that is the areas in me where I was just well, then fuck it. I'm going to make my own films how I want to make them. And so that was just getting a camera, buying a Zoom and a microphone, and paying $300 for Final Cut 10, and just I have everything that I need. I can make a film, and just starting to make films that way and being self-sufficient. Really, once I started to understand and figure out how experimental film could function in an Indigenous context, I just started making work on my own. I never really applied for funding. because like these films are always hard to explain, or I never liked to try to explain them, because once I would try, they just sounded dumb, you know, or just a lot of like blank stares. So I just started thinking of making the work as the sort of proof of concept. This is the thing that I can't explain that I'm doing. And that's just how I've been making films ever since, with the sense of like the films explain themselves. I don't want to feel beholden to anyone, any sort of funder, any sort of granting institution or whoever to have a deliverable, because ultimately I think like I want the films to be what they should be, you know, without trying to fit into any sort of box. I mean, as far as like the tokenization thing, like that's real. You know, sometimes I feel like it's easy for people to program me or curate me because they're looking for a native artist. I don't know. I go back and forth on that. I'm not making any concessions for the work or who I'm making it for. If this white organization wants to tokenize me, then that's their problem, not mine. It just means that the work's getting out there and people are seeing it on its own terms. And I mean, I'm never going to change anything in a film for whoever wants to screen it or air it or install it. I do have thoughts about how it's presented or how it's contextualized, but that just becomes part of a bigger conversation of having more agency in how the work's being shown. And then also just like, what does it then mean to be the token or to be one of many tokens? And what does it mean to bring others with you? Because I feel like that's sort of like lateral oppression has existed in Native communities where there's been people that just, you know, want to be the lonely Indian in a room of white people. I just think the more people you can bring with you, the better, that you're not the one being burdened or having to shoulder this sort of idea of like having to perform and to be the token. And I think the more of us there are in these different spaces, the harder it is to essentialize these experiences, because there's a multitude of experiences. And I don't know. Those are some of the things that I think about that, I guess.
No, I mean, those are all super useful, I think. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to go back to Jafa just for a second, who is someone who's definitely like changed how I think about film for a really long time. And one of the things that he's been talking about is sort of immaturity of cinematic practice and its capacity to tell non-Eurocentric stories. And so, you know, I think about what you just said about, you know, 3x structure or 5x structure or whatever we think of as cinematic structure at all. There's still so little that we've actually done with the form and experimented with it. And so I'm curious for you, what limitations have you encountered? And if you want to share any of the ways that you've been manipulating the kind of materiality of cinema to get at the stories as they require you to do so.
Oh, yeah, totally. I feel like, I mean, well, I'd like to exhaust ideas. I mean, I feel like if I am reading a bunch of stuff, watching a bunch of stuff, thinking about a lot of stuff, that usually finds its way into the work. I guess like maybe 2 or 3 years of me making experimental films is really this idea of like ethnography or the ethnopoetic, and what are the challenges of that. And after I felt like I exhausted that idea, or at least my understanding of it, or just felt tired of making work that felt beholden to be responsive to white structures of cinema, then my focus turned towards, well, what happens when you make work that you're not responding to these white traditions or to a white prompt? And what are the possibilities with that? And so now I feel like there's a certain sort of space of like mythology or with the cycles of story that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I mean, in my many years of college, I took plenty of like Native literature classes too. And a big part of like understanding Native literature is this idea of nonlinear storytelling or cyclical storytelling or circular storytelling. And I never knew what that meant, you know? Like, I don't know what it means. I still don't know what it means. But I think that that's part of the process that I really enjoy about exploring that question or that concept is, what does it look like? What could it look like? And really not making work that isn't necessarily about trying to find the answers, but just seeking out further questions that give shape to these bigger ideas of what the possibilities and what the potentials are of cinema in these different forms. I love not knowing things and saying, I don't know.
You mentioned ethnopoetics, and I'd be curious, you know, what do you mean by that?
I first heard it in an essay by Elliot Weinberger called The Camera People, where he goes over the history of ethnographic film from the earliest films like Nanook of the North up until the present. At the time, I think the essay was written in the 90s. First, he says, like, you know, ethnographic film is a very, very young medium and mode of making film, and film is so young in general, and that there's a lot more to be discovered and there's a lot more to be established around what this idea of ethnographic film is. And his proposal or idea was the ethnopoetic, which is a mode of filmmaking that would emerge when people who traditionally have had cameras pointed at them pick them up and start pointing them at the things that they want to point them at and start making the films that are reflective of their own experience. And that's the ethnopoetic in those regards. And I was really drawn to that. And I think I still am. I think it's a beautiful thought. It's complicated. It's definitely a complicated thought. How I think about it now comes from that sort of like still positioning and centering white ethnographic tradition as something to be responded to rather than abandoned or ignored.
Yeah, I love that as well. I also really I pulled a quote from an interview you did with Adam Perron for Sundance related to what you just said. You said it's empowering to realize that you don't have to make films for a white audience and consider whether or not they understand the cultural references. And, I think that's such a liberating place. I'm curious to realize that you could do that. And so how are you freed from that?
I feel like that goes into, the first instances of shit talking with my friends about films. It's just, wanting to make films where we don't have to spend 20 minutes teaching a white audience or giving them a history lesson. Like that film that I mentioned we made, the idea was just to make a film about three friends building a fishing scaffold and not explaining what we're doing or why we're doing it, but just like us knowing. I remember watching a Pichitpang Weerasethakul, Uncle Boomy, who can recall his past lives, and thinking like white audiences love this. They're not asking him to explain what this means and what that means and to explain like Thai cosmology. They just accept it, or accept the mystery of it. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe that's another form of exotification, but I was just like, well, then why, when natives make film, are there all these questions? Like, well, what does this mean? What's the symbolism of this? Where does this tradition come from? And that's deeply grounded in this idea of authenticity, or to have a white audience member or whoever it is ask you to prove how you know what you know and to be in awe of it. And that goes into just this sort of performance aspect of indigeneity, of just who has control over the performance. Powwows, I think about a lot because of that. They're designed in the early 1900s after the reservation system was established in order to draw white tourists to the reservation to make money, to sell beadwork, to give performances. They're an extension of the Wild West show. And it's they're very a new cultural phenomenon, but also one that retains a lot of agency for Native people. It's just it's like these sort of concentric circles of awareness of who's looking in. It's you have the dance floor with the dancers and the drummers, and outside of that, you have the people sitting around, family members, people with their camp chairs, taking breaks between songs. Outside of that, you have the bleachers for the audience, and outside of that, you have the vendors selling food, selling beadwork, selling toys, selling whatever. And all the while, you have tourists coming through, taking pictures. And one of the first places I was told that I have agency over who can take my picture is my parents, my family. You're walking around with your outfit on, with your beadwork, your bustle, your feathers, and we have white people coming to the reservation to the powwow taking your picture, but you can say no. You can say, yeah, you can take my picture, but give me $5. Mm-hmm. And it's just that sort of relationship to the camera and representation, and then also the sort of spectacle of it, but also the insider aspect of it. Saturday afternoon is, one of the busiest times at a powwow. That's when you have all the visitors. But my favorite part is midnight Saturday. There's one or two dance categories left. Everyone's gone except for the powwow people. You just have the dancers walking around. Half of their outfits are off and just relaxing, visiting. My grandma, she'd always have a pot of coffee at her campsite, and just people would come and visit and chat. And those moments of just the space of natives being native is just really special. And seeing and growing up with that sort of variance between the performative spectacle and the quiet intimacy of being native in this space was really powerful and potent. I think definitely informed this idea of making work for a native audience, not feeling like you have to explain something, and to just know this isn't for you. And to be able to show these things, certain things, allude to them, and have a specific audience understand what they mean.
Scene is a journal of film and visual culture focused on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities globally. Subscribe today and receive 2 beautifully designed issues a year, featuring essays, reviews, interviews, and more from critics, artists, and other luminaries of color. Learn more at scene.blackstarfest.org.
You're listening to Many Lumens. Now back to my interview with Sky Hopinka. So you grew up playing music as a child and in high school, and so I think it's not surprising how much sound figures so prominently in your work. And I was curious, in the process of forming your projects, at what stage are you thinking about score or any kind of sonic influences, or are you thinking about the visuals first and then coming to the sound?
I think like sound always comes first, like in some form or another. It's usually the thing that, if anything, it gives me a sense of the tone or the feeling that I want to go for, that I want to express visually. Even when I first started making films, when I started editing, I would always try to find some soundtrack to edit to, just as a sort of foundation. Even like if I would change the soundtrack later on, music has always like been the sort of framework or scaffolding that I used to, start to understand the visuals or piece things together. And even with not just music, but I think just sonic sort of soundscapes, or just walking around with the field recorder and seeing what I could record and what I could gather and how I could start editing those into the sound space, thinking about what the possibilities are of movement and abstraction. But yeah, then it happens pretty much in tandem with the visuals and just kind of going back and forth between the two.
So we talked a little bit about sound, but I'm curious generally how the films that you're making, if they start with story after sound, or however you're getting to what becomes the text, how does it come to you? And what is your research process like? I'm curious if you write first and then meditate on the image and sound, or if the sound is first, then does the text come after that?
It varies from film to film, but I think generally, I will just go shoot, whether that's with friends in Alaska or with the language group or on a road trip. And from that, never really feeling satisfied with the images on their own, just thinking what speaks to these images, whether that's a bigger idea or a collection of recordings. There's this film that I made called Judgy Aprox, and it's about my dad, but I had these recordings of my dad for 10 years. Just whenever I'd see him, I'd ask him to sing some songs that he made or songs that he learned from the Power Trail. And they just really came together with this film when I was on a road trip, where it's just finding a bridge between these two separate folders of material that really spoke to each other. And from there, starting to think about, what does this mean? What does this mean to me? How can I shape this into something that's reflective of something that I can't necessarily, put to words or put to writing? Often, I don't like to think I know what a film is about until after I'm done with it and have a chance to think about it, or have a chance to watch it with people, or to just let it sit and then start realizing where these decisions came from, or these choices that I made, how they fit together. I like to think of myself as an intuitive filmmaker, but behind intuition is a lot of baggage, a lot of history, and a lot of choices, and a lot of experiences that shaped how and why you make these intuitive choices.
What you're describing feels to me like when I hear jazz musicians talk about the improvisation process. And there was something that I was wanting to ask you about. We did our grief seminar just last week, and one of the speakers was Maʻli Karima. And in closing conversation with one of our producers, Farah, they started talking about this. I don't know how familiar you are with Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but they're both African writers in the 60s and 70s. Writing about choosing a language in which to write as a political act, right? So Ngugi is, I'm going to write in my mother tongue, and Chinua is I'm going to write in English, and so that it's more accessible. And of course, they're both right. And Maʻli, thinking about film, said that it's immaterial which choice we make, and that what matters more is the thought system that we're espousing. And for him, he started talking about jazz as the thought system which can teach us the most. And he talks about it being unruly and genius. What you just described just sounds so familiar to what I've heard jazz musicians talk about, how they get to work. Improv is not only about intuition, and intuition being, sort of receptive to spirit, right? And being open to a kind of channeling, but it comes with lots of practice that is married with that kind of channeling. And so I was curious for you if that resonates at all, or if there is something similar in Indigenous tradition that you might equate to jazz.
No, that resonates a lot. I think about that, just the things that go into making something that exists outside of making something. Actually, I think when I was like playing music when I was younger, like, I mean, I think I read something or heard something where someone said that thinking in your head about playing something or playing music or practicing your instrument, it can be as good as actually physically playing the instrument, or like you need both. You need like the sort of thought processes that go into that, as well as like the muscle memory. That's one of those things that has kind of stuck with me, where I would feel bad at times for like not making something or not editing, but I'd spend like hours thinking about something. Just like all these different ways of understanding the material and what's working and what's not working. And I think that's a big part of the work too. And so I think just expanding this idea of like what work is, or what practice is, or what it means to be making, because I think all of these things that you do in your life inform that. Maybe some things more than others, but I think that all of these things go into how we understand what we're doing and how we're communicating and how we're understanding ourselves.
Yeah. I want to take a sort of slight pivot. In an interview, you talked about wanting to move away from showing the violence that occurred at Standing Rock and the violence that is regularly enacted upon Native bodies. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about this and other acts of refusal that you've developed or might be continuing to develop in your pursuit of making cinema for Native audiences.
A bulk of my work is mostly like landscape or places, with this sort of refusal of showing bodies or people or spaces out of a sense of being protective of like friends and family and wanting some distance, you know. With the piece on Standing Rock, this film called Dislocation Blues, it's just like very literally being there and seeing like 200 camera crews, people with cameras, journalists, media organizations, whatever, just like being hungry to film the actions and the violence and looking for that shot. It just felt really gross. The sort of like maxim that I follow is if it feels gross, it's probably gross. Even like filming maڵni, the feature, I did so very carefully or cautiously, or try to be respectful of my friendships with Sweetwater and Jordan and the spaces that I was filming and how I was filming them and what permission that I had there. I feel like there's a lot of openness when it comes to Native communities. You know, a film that I made called I'll Remember You As You Were, Not As What You'll Become. It's about Ho-Chunk reincarnation, but there's this book that Paul Radin wrote called The Road of Life and Death, which is about our reincarnation ceremonies. And I made it halfway through the introduction when I stopped. This isn't how I wanted to learn this information. It's not for me in this way. So I just like pulled some texts that were more just descriptive of our belief or like why, and made a film about that distance. I think there's like a number of ways of trying to establish some boundaries where there haven't been any for the last 150 years, and develop some protocols or find out what the protocols are of the communities that I'm filming. You know, what can be filmed, what can't be filmed, what can be talked about with outsiders, what can't be talked about with outsiders, and how to reinforce those boundaries and that agency of these peoples who have been exploited by film and by media and by science.
Yeah, that's really powerful to have those boundaries asserted, even if it's sort of retroactively, right? Mm-hmm. You know, like in my case, I think about Black American people looking toward text about African peoples or about, you know, enslaved peoples in the early days of the U.S. and thinking through how we make decisions about what it means to be, period, mm-hmm. right? And it's sort of based on this one particular study. And sometimes it's like if you get access to other information, you realize like this was this person's opinion and this is this person's observation, and it is just that. And it isn't the same as perhaps like a more mundane approach, mm-hmm. you know, and not seeing it as exotic. And so I love that you shut that down. Like, I'm not going to study it this way. I'm going to like come at it maybe more experientially or culturally. You've also talked about, there's a narrative short that you have. Is it pronounced wee-wee?
Hui-hui?
Yes. You wrote to see our language in an unspectacular way, where it's just the way that we talk. In, you know, narrative film, how often I think for non-white people, we're not allowed to just be, mm-hmm. right? And so how powerful it is when there are narrative films where there's, you know, nothing happening. Right? Like nothing exceptional, nothing tragic. It's a quiet kind of power. And I think it's just one that we take for granted.
I mean, with TV shows, especially like TV shows that had like 25 episode seasons, there was always those episodes where nothing happened and it's just like world building or something. I mean, actually, I think a lot about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where in many of the episodes of the seasons, it's just about the relationship between two of the characters. And you have a break from the sort of like action. You have a break from the sort of conflict. And I think that really is reflected in just a lot of work that is about oppressed communities, because the things that you feel like you have to show or are being asked to show are the conflict, the tensions, and the stresses. It's like we carry these stresses with us every day of our lives. Like how can like the mundane and the boring be safe or just like, you know, a release from that tension?
Yeah. I'd love to ask you, you've primarily made short films and of course one feature that are largely in museum spaces and in festivals. And I'm curious if you have any desire or interest in making work that might be more conventional, like for film or television. Is that of interest to you?
You know, 10 years ago, I started making films so that I could make a rom-com one day. This is just my very circuitous way of going about that. But,
what kind of rom-com? I need more information.
I have no idea. Like, I mean, I've been thinking about it for years, but I don't know. There's just like, there's something comforting about that idea of a film, or just like, it's such a low stakes genre, you know?
Yeah.
But I guess about seeing like people that look like you, that come from a community you might be coming from, like, you know, figure out love, figure out friendship. Mm-hmm. It's a little cheesy, but I don't know. I like the idea of those films being made.
No, I don't think that's cheesy. I almost exclusively watch rom-coms. So I really appreciate that. I mean, you know, I'm obviously watching all kinds of other things for work, but they're very satisfying when they work.
I think so too.
Well, I'm looking forward to the rom-com.
Me too.
I'd love to ask you about Cousin, which is the collective that you co-founded in 2018 with Adam Khalil and Adam Perron and Alexandra Lazarich. And just curious, how did you all start this and what are you up to?
It started like over the course of like 2 or 3 years. I mean, there's moments where I would show work at experimental festivals and people would be like, oh, do you know Adam Khalil? I was like, oh, no, I don't. And he was like the other native making experimental work. I mean, he existed for a few years before I finally got a chance to meet him, and met him and his brother Zach, and it was just really great. They had just come out with their film, Not to Say, and it's a beautiful film. And so just like that started a conversation of, you know, being one of the few like native filmmakers that we knew about in these circles. And same thing with Alex, who was friends with Adam, and then Khalil, and then also meeting Adam Perron like through Sundance and like his work as a programmer and as a filmmaker. And really at the Flaherty seminar in 2018, I believe, we all got a chance to be in the same spot together for a week and a half. And just the idea of Cousin was born because it was great being around each other and being together, and to not feel alone, to not feel like one of a few natives navigating these spaces. And we really just wanted to try to find a way to make it okay to be an Indigenous experimental filmmaker. Because if there's hardly any support for experimental film in the United States, there's zero support for Indigenous experimental film in the United States. And similarly with Canada too, like First Nations, they have a lot of support system from Canada Council of the Arts, but again, it's like also geared more towards mainstream types of filmmaking. And so just like, how could we then give some money to some filmmakers, some artists that are interested in experimental work or installation, and not be too prescriptive about what that means? I mean,
yeah, we
all come from our own backgrounds and our own experiences and, you know, our own privileges and our own oppressions. How can we add more voices to this conversation that go beyond what we know, and things that we don't want to speak to, things that we're not the ones to speak to?
Yeah. Well, hopefully there's room in the future for like a BlackStar collaboration, and we can call it Play Cousin.
That'd be great.
Was that your first Flaherty in 2018?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sad that I didn't make it to that one. I know that it was like exceptional and a dream, because I went to Flaherty in 2014 when there were like 10 people of color total.
Yeah.
And so seeing the Instagram posts from that year was really like amazing. But you're programming Flaherty this year, or you're one of the programmers, right?
Yeah, I'm co-programming with Almudena Escobar Lopez. We're pretty excited for it, and also like right in the middle of slotting the program together. So it's a little bit overwhelming, but we're looking forward to it.
I am too. It should be very exciting. I wanted to ask you, who are some of your intellectual or even spiritual or artistic North Stars?
That's a great question. I tell Adnan, definitely. I love her work and her poetry and her painting. I really love the way that Peter Rose makes films and deals with language. Besmal Sharif is a Palestinian filmmaker who makes some really beautiful films that, really point to how complicated issues of lands, those politics around that, and the ways that you can express those through films and through art. Why am I blanking right now? I have on my phone the reminders. I make lists there, and I have a list of favorite foods because I always forget when people ask me the question of what do I like to eat.
Well, now I have to ask you, what do you like to eat? What are your favorite foods?
I have egg salad sandwich, pears, tomato soup, eggs over easy, Camerones a la diabla, pad thai, cornbread, small tomatoes. See, this is like, why do I need a list for this? But these are the things that I do.
Small tomatoes. This is so specific. Why small tomatoes?
It's like, like when you eat them and they just kind of like burst in your mouth, It's like really like a refreshing sort of burst of tomato deliciousness.
Well, I'll be very Torian and tell you that the list is okay. I accept all of those choices. I think some of those artists are really amazing, and I can see them showing up in your work. So I'm at our sort of last question, which is there anything that you're interested in pursuing that is not filmmaking? And also, what is next for you?
I think I like working more with photography. I've done a series of photographs where I etch text on the images after I print them out. I'm also interested in painting, so I need to watch some YouTube videos and figure out how that's done. I like the idea of that, or just like the process of that sounds fun or just relaxing. Trying to focus more on writing in the next few months as well, more poems and more essays. So that's something I'm like hoping to get back into. I think a big part of like where I'm at right now, or my understanding of that, is just thinking about the space that I occupy as a filmmaker, as a curator, as a programmer. And really, like, what am I missing? Someone asked me about my curatorial practice the other day, and I just said it's like bringing some cool people together and getting out of the way. I think about my privileges every day and my oppressions. Growing up as like a native cis man, has its oppressions, but also has its privileges. And so I really want to make more space for more people, more artists who have different experiences than me, and to support them however I can with whatever platform that I have. I think that's really important because, like I said, no one wants to be the only one. And I think the bigger idea and the broader idea of community that we can foster, the better.
That's perfect. What an amazing way to end. I really do feel like that's just like such a beautiful way to look forward. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
You too.
Sky Hopinka is a filmmaker, writer, curator, and photographer. To explore more of his work, visit skyhopinka.com. Follow Sky's collective Cousin on Instagram at cousin_collective. This season of Many Lumens is brought to you by Open Society Foundations. It is produced by BlackStar Projects in partnership with Rowhome Productions. The host and executive producer of Many Lumens is me, Maori Karmael Holmes. Our producer is Imani Leonard. Associate producers are Yurit Reinheimer and Farah Rahaman. Managing producer is Alex Lewis. Executive editor is John Myers. Our music supervisor is David Little Dave Adams, BlackStar's Music and Cinema Fellow, supported by the Pop Culture Collaborative. Our theme song was composed by Vijay Mohan and remixed by Little Dave. Sending you light, and see you next time.